Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's good to be back recording a lecture here on Chapter 20 that deals with growth and productivity. This is going to be the only lecture I'm going to have for Chapter 20. It's a pretty straightforward chapter. I want to add a few things. So read that, and then next we're going to turn our attention to the labor market, looking at unemployment, something that's really been in the news the last few days. I can hardly wait to get to that. So one of the key parts of this chapter is the idea of productivity. Productivity in English just means, okay, what is the output per worker? How much is each worker contributing? And the reason that's important is that this is the key to a nation's standard of living. If you can make your workers more productive, there'll be more that's produced and there's more to share. Just give you a quick example. If you have 100 people in a nation and they produce 100 shirts, everyone can have one shirt. 100 people, 100 shirts. But if they can now produce 200, if you've now made everybody more productive, then everybody can have two shirts. In other words, you'll have a higher standard of living. I think that's also known as getting your shirt together, something like that. Okay, the book looks at something. I want to elaborate on it. I also want to extend it. But the question is, what determines the level of real GDP? This is something, it's a fancy word, it's a big word called the aggregate production function. What that means in English is we're just saying what's the relationship between the inputs, what we use to produce products, and what we're able to produce, GDP. GDP, the output, what the nation produces. What we're really doing in this part of the course, I'm giving you all the tools. And then later on, after we deal with unemployment, I'm going to start putting together a model to show you how all the things work, how things are interrelated. But GDP in a nation depends on the amount of labor, human capital, we'll talk about that in a minute, physical capital, and technology. Output depends on the inputs. So, when we talk about labor, that's just the number of workers. If a nation is able to increase the number of people working, they're going to have more GDP. If, on the other hand, the number of workers declines or the population declines, they're going to have less GDP. After World War II, Germany and Japan had suffered great losses. Their GDP fell in part because the number of workers they had gone down because people had perished in the war. GDP depends on labor, but it also depends on what's called human capital, the education and the skills of the workers, of the labor. If you can make workers more productive, if you can train them, give them skills, give them more education, this is going to result in more GDP. If your workers know how to operate the machinery, drive the trucks, conduct the business, etc. of the nation can have more. This is what we call human capital, the education and training of the workers. There's also what we call physical capital. This is just the equipment, the machinery, the infrastructure. If a nation has more physical capital, they're able to produce more. Joseph Stalin in Russia, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s, he tried to say, look, we've got to increase the amount of physical capital. He had people building factories, trying to build steel mills, etc., so there could be more equipment so they could increase the level of GDP. Of course, he did that by starving 20 million people, which is not really the best way of doing things. And finally, technology. How do we combine our inputs to make GDP? Sometimes you can think of things that are very high tech, the latest machines that can do things. Sometimes it's even very low tech, just figuring out a better way to grow your crops, when to plant them, or how to plow to get your crops to grow more. But anything that says, how do we combine our workers, their training, and their physical capital, the way we combine them to produce more, that's what we call technology. Now, what the book does, and I think it's a really great way of understanding things, is let's just take this whole production function, that's just what it's called, the relationship between GDP and these four inputs, and let's divide through by the amount of labor. So what we have here is the GDP divided by the number of workers. Hey, that's just productivity. So now what we can say is productivity, which determines our standard of living, what each worker can produce. Well, labor divided by labor, that's 1. We're not going to worry about that. Human capital per worker. What's the education level of each worker? So if you go back to, maybe 100 years ago, the average worker in the United States had less than a high school education. Today, we find out 30% of Americans have a college degree. They have a lot more education. So when you have more human capital per worker, a nation can produce more. Physical capital per worker. If you have people that have more equipment, they're able to produce more. I've been in developing nations. If, for example, you have people that are trying to dig a ditch with a shovel, they're not going to be as productive as if they had more physical capital. If they had, let's say, one of those backhoes that is able to dig a trench, it'll do it a lot faster. You can imagine, for example, people trying to haul things on their back versus having a train to haul things or a truck. More physical capital per worker, the higher the productivity is going to be. You can't really talk about technology being divided by labor. Generally, the technology, what one worker knows is known, or what one worker or firm knows is known by others, so we won't really divide that. But the idea here is productivity depends on the amount of human capital per worker and the amount of physical capital per worker and the level of technology. Now, the book talks about these 4 things, but I've been teaching this course more than a few years. I'd like to add 2, and I can make a very strong case for why they belong, as well. One of the things is natural resources. Why is it that some nations, for example, Kuwait, is a very wealthy nation? It's not because they have a lot of people. It's not because their labor force is that educated, or they have equipment, or they have great technology. They have oil. If a nation has certain natural resources, they can produce more. I visited Mexico several times. And what you'll find out in Mexico, you might have a farmer that is trying to grow corn on land that's very dry. The same farmer with the same equipment in Ohio would grow a lot more corn. Why? The soil is better here and we get a lot more rainfall. I would argue that be it rainfall, be it oil, natural resources really make a difference. Another factor, and historians have known this for a long time, I think political scientists have as well, is institutions. Do you have a rule of law? So, for example, do you have a court system that's really fair? In some nations, who wins it? If there's a business dispute, who wins the case in court? Well, does the judge belong to your tribe or your family? If the answer is yes, you win. If that's the case, people are going to hesitate to go into business. If the government can come along and take over your factory, you're certainly not going to invest. So if you have a rule of law, institutions, the government institutions, the law, that's what really is also going to affect the level of GDP. Now, sometimes it turns out increasing productivity doesn't result in a higher standard of living. Sometimes, for example, if we look at natural resources, well, we find out generally there's only so much we want of natural resources. Give you an example. If nations all across the world figure out how to double the production of coffee, the supply of coffee goes up. But in general, natural resources, coffee beans, oil, copper, corn, they have a relatively inelastic demand curve. In other words, as the price changes, people don't buy that much more. That just is, it just turns out that people will say, look at, if coffee beans go down in price, I'm not going to, run out and start drinking twice as much coffee. Although my lectures would probably be done in half the time if I did. Anyway, the problem is for natural resources that have an inelastic demand curve, when the supply increases, the price goes way down. And the result is, even though they become more productive, it might not help them. So just a kind of a note that what I said before about productivity, also depends, can you sell the product? Is productivity always possible? And the answer, is increased productivity always possible? And the answer is not always. Let's go back to the time of Bach. And suppose you wanted to hire musicians to play a string quartet. Now, I believe, the mathematics is such that, if we look at a string quartet, it takes 4 musicians to make a quartet. If you want 1 hour of music, it takes 4 hours of labor, 1 hour from each musician to play a string quartet in the time of Bach. If we want to do it today, guess what? It still takes 4 hours of labor. For some services, it's really impossible to get increases in productivity. Barbers are not any more productive than they used to be. So, what's the situation? In agriculture, what we find out, natural resources, when productivity rises, people don't want that much more broccoli. Maybe they don't want any. But people don't want that much more copper or oil or grapes, whatever. So if productivity increases, you need fewer workers. With services, think of college professors, lawyers, stockbrokers. If productivity stays relatively constant, as people's income goes up, they usually buy services. Remember what we said before? The United States is pretty much a service economy. So what we see is that as the economy develops, as productivity increases here, we need fewer people in agriculture. The number of farmers has declined over the years. If you go back to 1900, 50% of Americans worked on farms. Today, the figure is about 2 to 3%. But that's why employment has increased in services. In part, people want them, and it's hard to increase productivity. Okay, that's all I really wanted to say about Chapter 20. I'm sorry I should have moved this over there. The last few pages of Chapter 20 deal with convergence. That just means our developing nations catching up with developed ones. So read that. It's kind of an interesting read. You're not really going to have to do any math based on this chapter. So if you read some of the formulas for growth, don't worry about it. So read this chapter, watch this video, do the sapling, which I'll post relatively soon. Take care, stay well, and we'll talk next time about unemployment.